Nothing basic about it, but we'll try to make it so. Common Rule ABCs with OHRP. In the next 40 or so minutes, I'll provide a brief overview of how the Common Rule works with a focus on the perspective of the Department of Health and Human Services. Please note that the opinions expressed here are mine and do not necessarily reflect the policy of the HHS. Any references to the regulatory provisions in the Common Rule in this presentation have been simplified to facilitate understanding. Always refer to the actual text of the Common Rule available on the OHRP website for a complete and accurate description. The hyperlink here will take you to the page. For this presentation, I'll first say a few words about the ethical tension that exists in human research and how the regulations came about. I'll talk about the ethical and federal regulatory framework for protecting human participants of research, and I'll provide you with an orientation of how the Common Rule works. Research is defined in the Common Rule as a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Researchers identified a question to ask, develop a structured plan to collect the information needed to answer the question, ultimately adding to the wealth of knowledge that hopefully would bring about the advancement of science and the common good. When research studies involve humans, they provide a means, a tool, for researchers to achieve the goal of contributing to generalizable knowledge. Volunteers participate in experiments, provide information about themselves, and sometimes also their biological samples, all with the goal of answering the research questions. We should be clear that research studies are not carried out to provide a service or a treatment to people, although that is not to say that participants may never benefit from their participation. In the process of conducting human research and pursuing the common good, it is very important to pay attention to protecting the rights and welfare of individual participants in order that they will not become merely a means for others to advance knowledge. After all, nobody likes being used by others. Nobody likes to be treated like an object. When this happens, people get very upset. And this was what happened with the syphilis study of Tuskegee. The disease was endemic over there in the 1930s and treatment was unsatisfactory. Government researchers decided to study the natural course of the disease by documenting the signs and symptoms and progress of the disease of the people affected, many of whom were African Americans living in impoverished conditions. Researchers repeatedly obtained blood and conducted other invasive procedures to obtain biological samples from the people, never explaining to them what disease they had and what the procedures and specimens were for. In the 1940s, when penicillin became available as a highly effective treatment for syphilis, the subjects were not told about its availability. They were not given the treatment, and some were even prevented from finding out and accessing the treatment. To this day, I still find this bit of history to be quite shocking. I cannot imagine that these government researchers were horrible, malicious people by nature. Yet, in their desire to advance knowledge, to preserve the opportunity to learn about the natural cause of advanced syphilis, they disregarded the rights and welfare of the people before them and robbed them of their humanity. The research subjects became merely a means to these researchers. Scientists are mostly pragmatic people. When we are so focused in pursuing our goals, it may be easy for us to forget our responsibilities to those who partake in the process. The syphilis study went on for many years until the 1970s, when the New York Times reported about it. That immediately resulted in a huge public outcry that led Congress to take action, creating the National Research Act and establishing the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects to identify basic ethical principles that should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects. As a result of the Commissioner's thorough deliberation, the Belmont Report was published. There's a hyperlink here that you can use to get to our website to read all about the Belmont Report. Eventually, federal regulations were developed based on the Belmont ethical principles, and in 1991, the Common Rule was simultaneously adopted by 15 federal departments and agencies for them to guide the human research that they fund. After some 25 years and faced with a rapidly changing research landscape, the Common Rule underwent revision and was updated a few years ago. We refer to this new version as the 2018 requirements, or more generally as the revised Common Rule, and the older version as the pre-2018 Common Rule. If you are getting federal money today to do research, it is the revised Common Rule that you need to follow. So now let's take a look at the Office for Human Research Protections, or OHRP. We are a small office within the U.S. Federal Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. OHRP provides leadership and coordinates the federal government's effort for protecting human research participants for the research that the government conducts or supports. OHRP holds the regulatory authority to the set of regulations called HHS Policies for Human Research Protections, codified at 45, Code of Federal Regulation, or CFR 46. Apart from its very important responsibility for compliance and oversight for this set of regulations, OHRP also develops policies to help the research community understands and interprets the regulations. It also has an education division to conduct educational activities, such as this webinar that we are having, to help the research community understand how to apply the regulations. There are 5 subparts to the HHS regulations at 45 CFR 46. Subpart A is what is referred to as the Common Rule. There are 3 other subparts, B, C, and D, that provide additional regulations to protect certain groups of vulnerable subjects. If you are getting money from HHS to conduct human subjects research, then you must also comply with the subpart regulations for vulnerable populations. Subpart E stipulates the requirements for registering institutional review boards, or IRBs. Please note that while IRBs that review non-exempt human subjects research under the Common Rule need to be registered with OHRP, this is merely a registration process. Registration itself does not in any way confer accreditation or assurance of the quality of the registered IRB. It is also important to note that the regulatory framework provides a baseline standard for human research protections. Compliance of the regulations itself does not mean that the research study has no ethical concerns whatsoever, or that it presents no risks to participants whatsoever. I'll come back to this point a little bit later. So what is common about the Common Rule? We call it the Common Rule because it is commonly followed across the U.S. federal government, in fact, by 20 federal departments and agencies through various mechanisms for the human subjects research that they fund. On the right here, you can see these 20 federal departments and agencies represented here. The Common Rule also provides the foundational regulatory framework for human research protections that are funded by the federal governments. Each Common Rule department or agency is, however, responsible for the oversight of the research that it supports or conducts. Here, I'd like to say a few words about the HHS office that you often see. FDA, OHRP, and HHS sponsors of research, such as the NIH. There is a lot of confusion about who's who and who does what. OHRP is within the Office of the Secretary under the Department of Health and Human Services. The National Institutes of Health and others, such as the CDC, CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and HRSA, Health Resources and Services Administration, for example, are also under the Department of Health and Human Services. They each have their own mission. When they fund research, they will also develop related policies that dictate how they operate and administer the funding. FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, is also under the HHS. Their primary responsibility is to regulate clinical investigations involving drug, devices, and biologics, regardless of funding source, to make sure that they are safe for public use. So if a pharmaceutical company wants to release a new drug into the market, they must first submit the safety and efficacy data for the drug to FDA for review and approval. The FDA would want to make sure that any human research the company conducted was done in compliance with their requirements for human subjects research protections. These requirements are very similar to those under the Common Rule and shared similar origins, but there are some distinct differences too. Again, OHRP's role is to regulate human research funded by HHS. Any non-exempt human subjects research funded by an HHS sponsor like NIH would come under OHRP's oversight. When such research are also clinical investigations involving new drugs, devices, or biologics, they will simultaneously come under FDA oversight as well. Now let's talk about how the Common Rule works. The Common Rule tries to balance a tension of protecting individuals' rights and welfare on the one hand, without at the same time creating overwhelming or impossible obstacles to the advancement of science. The ethical principle of beneficence includes furthering the common good after all. But regulations are a blunt instrument. Too prescriptive, it becomes impossible to apply across a wide variety of situations. As such, the Common Rule is written largely with the goal of setting some minimal acceptable standards for research to be protective and ethical. Hence, mere compliance does not mean that a research study presents no risk to participants or has no ethical concerns whatsoever. Compliance is great, but compliance alone may not be sufficient when it comes to the responsibilities that are owed to research participants. I have mentioned that the regulations were developed based on the ethical principles from the Belmont Report. So here are the three main principles of the Belmont Report. Respect for persons is about respecting an individual's right to make decisions for themselves. Beneficence is about maximizing the benefits that we could get out of doing research. And justice is about balancing burdens and benefits. So how do these principles translate into the regulations? For respect for persons, you find in the regulations that there's a lot of text covering how informed consent needs to be obtained and from whom, what information needs to be provided for the consent process, who the information is for, and for what purpose. For beneficence, the regulations focus on the review of research, that risks to participants need to be minimized, and that there are appropriate protections for research participants. There needs to be also a favorable risk and benefit assessment for the research. As for justice, there are regulatory provisions for equitable subject selection, that no one group should be unnecessarily or overly burdened by research participation, and that people should not be deprived of the opportunity to reap the benefits from research by having appropriate representation. So what is in the Common Rule? You have the nuts and bolts, including description about the assurances that institutions need to file with the federal government to get research funding, various definitions, and description of the conditions for exemptions. Detailed stipulations concerning institutional review boards, for example, what the membership requirement needs to be, the composition of the IRB, who can serve, the mechanisms for IRB reviews, full board at a convened meeting or expedited by an experienced IRB member, and then details on the review criteria, what reviewers need to consider before approving research, how to take the minutes, records keeping, intervals of review that are needed, etc. And then, of course, very importantly, what needs to go into informed consent before people can participate in these research? What information needs to be provided, under what conditions, and when some of these conditions could be waived, etc. Finally, there are other stipulations in the Common Rule about, say, incidents reporting, institutional responsibilities, and other requirements, etc. So how does the Common Rule work? The Common Rule regulatory requirements generally apply to non-exempt human subjects research funded by the Department of Health and Human Services or other Common Rule agencies and departments. I've highlighted non-exempt human subjects research here. We will talk about this later. For now, we will focus on funding. So for institutions receiving federal or Common Rule agency funds for non-exempt human subjects research, they must file an assurance with the federal government before they can receive the money to do the human subjects research. This is usually the Federal Wide Assurance, or FWA, that's operated under OHRP. Again, each Common Rule department and agency is responsible for its own compliance oversight and may have additional policies and requirements regarding assurances and so on. OHRP's responsibility for compliance oversight is for the HHS-funded human subjects research, including those sponsored under the NIH, CDC, HRSA, etc. So we were talking about funding. What if the research is not funded by a Common Rule agency or department? What is the relevance then of the Common Rule? There are several possibilities. Institutions that are not receiving federal funding for their human research may still be compelled to comply with the Common Rule by another authority, such as the state government. I understand that this may be the case for human research conducted by institutions in the state of New York and California, for example. Now, some institutions may have voluntarily selected to come under OHRP's compliance oversight by doing something called checking the box when they file their FWA with OHRP. This way, they voluntarily bring in OHRP's oversight jurisdiction for all the research they conduct, even if they were not funded by HHS. Please note that OHRP has no expectation for institutions to check the box. It is completely voluntary. As a matter of fact, OHRP has plans to remove this option of checking the box eventually. What if institution has not checked the box? There's no box to check. What does that mean? Institutions are always welcome to voluntarily adopt the Common Rule as a framework of reference for the research they conduct. But compliance oversight would be through using their own institutional policies. OHRP will not have jurisdiction and will not be involved. This allows institutions the flexibility to be able to rely on a well-recognized framework, but also entertain certain adjustments and flexibilities to accommodate for the research they conduct. Lastly, if you're not getting funding from Common Rule agencies and not compelled by other authorities to follow the Common Rule, institutions can of course choose to disregard the Common Rule and not use it at all. That said, the Common Rule has been around for a long time. It is very well known and very well recognized. It was developed based on solid ethical principles, and many people are using it. It may be harder and more complicated for an institution to come up with another framework for oversight of research, and without one, there may not be much confidence or public trust for the research the institution conducts. So, okay, there is Common Rule agency funding. So now what does that mean? Right? Remember those words I bolded. Regulatory requirements apply when the project is non-exempt human subjects research. This generally means that, amongst other things, you have to have an active FWA on file to receive the federal research funds, that your research study will need to go through a very structured IRB review process that is conducted according to the regulatory requirements. And unless the IRB has waived the requirement as allowed under the regulations, you will need to get informed consent from participants in the way stipulated by the regulations. Hence, it becomes really important to know whether a research project is non-exempt human subjects research. So how do you make that determination? You make that determination by asking these questions in this order. So the first question you ask is, does the activity involve research? If it's research, you ask the next question. Does the research involve human subjects? And if it's human subjects research, the last question would be whether it meets the condition for any of the exemptions provided in the common rule. Please note that each of these terms, research, human subjects, exemptions, have their proper definitions and descriptions in the common rule. So they are not used or understood necessarily in the same way as a lay person would understand them. You need to refer to these definitions in the common rule to make these determinations. So, on the flip side, what does it mean when regulatory requirements do not apply? Typically, that would be when the project is not research as defined or described in the common rule, or the research does not involve human subjects as the term is defined in the common rule, or if the human subject research meets the conditions for one of the exemptions stipulated in the common rule. Under these situations, the regulatory requirements of the common rule typically do not apply. This means that investigators and institutions have the flexibility beyond the regulations. There would be no need for the kind of standardized IRB review as prescribed by the regulations, or to obtain consent according to what the regulations stipulate. Right, but it doesn't mean that, oh well, in that case, we don't even need to go and ask people if they would agree to help you out, to do something or provide you with something for your research. But you will have the flexibility for how to conduct the process, what information you provide, and whether a signature is needed, etc., as long as it is acceptable to your institution and it complies with the institutional policies. So again, under these conditions, when the project is not research, or it's not human subjects research, or is exempt human subjects research, and for that matter, when it's not funded by a common rule agency or otherwise compelled by an authority to follow it, institutions and investigators have flexibilities for conducting the research outside of the regulatory constraints and requirements. But do remember that the ethical responsibilities to participants remain. So this is a flow chart to show you how the determination process works. You start by asking the question, is it research? If the answer is no, stop. The common rule regulatory requirements does not apply. If it's the answer to the question is yes, it is research, then ask the next question, is it human subjects research? And if the answer is no, again, you stop. You don't have to consider the common rule requirements. If the answer to the last question is yes, then you ask the next question, is it exempt? Does the study meet the conditions stipulated for one of the exemptions in the common rule? If it does, then yes, it's exempt from the common rule regulatory requirements, and if it's no, then it means that this is non-exempt human subjects research. And typically that would mean that it will have to go through the IRB review process as prescribed by the regulations, and you need to do the research according to all the different common rule requirements, such as for informed consent and so on. By now, many of you may be thinking, making the determination of what constitutes non-exempt human subjects research or otherwise seems like a really important task. So who gets to make the determination? The common rule does not stipulate who should be making these determinations. Generally, OHRP does not recommend investigators to make these determinations, obviously because there is an inherent conflict. It is understandable that researchers are likely to want their research to come under fewer regulatory demands and restrictions, hence may harbor a tendency to determine that their research doesn't come under the common rule regulatory requirements. So for investigators themselves to make this determination is probably not a good idea, especially when this whole process is about having some sort of independent assessment that researchers are doing the right thing to protect the rights and welfare of participants. Generally, it is recommended that institutions designate someone with knowledge and experience about the regulations and the ethics for human research protections to make the determinations. Now, often in reality, this would be the responsibility of somebody like an IRB professional, an administrator working in the institution's IRB or Research Administration Research Oversight Office. And there's a good reason for this to be the situation. So when institutions have a designated person or even a group of people in their research oversight office to make the determination, it ensures consistency and fairness to the investigators when the determination is made. It ensures that the determinations are made correctly to protect the institution from having a compliance issue with the federal government. Because if you make a wrong determination and a study really would not have fitted into an exempt category, for example, then you'll be out of compliance with the federal government. Separately, for research projects that do not require formal IRB review under the common rule, an institutional determination could still be very helpful to meet the independent review for ethics and protections that reputable journals often require at the time of publication submissions. Over and over, we'll hear stories about researchers getting into trouble with journals when they submit their research findings for publication. And then investigators suddenly find out that their projects never went through any independent oversight process, and now they have to go back to their institution's IRB office to ask for a retrospective review. But retrospective review doesn't really make sense if the research genuinely could have the potential to impact participants' rights and welfare. And what if the study actually would have required formal IRB review and approval under the common rule? So I guess many of us would agree that IRB professionals, or IRB administrators as they are often called, do have a crucial role to play in processing human research projects. For many institutions where most of the research they conduct aren't going to be the so-called non-exempt human subjects research that requires a very structured IRB review and documentation process under the common rule, the IRB professionals may actually have a bigger role to play than IRB members. An experienced IRB professional or administrator can conduct day in and day out determinations and do the triage process and provide support to the IRB. It makes sense, therefore, for institutions to invest the resources to train them well, to provide them with the support they need to do their job properly. Your investigators and your IRB members will appreciate knowledgeable and helpful IRB professionals. They are going to be like the gatekeeper for the institutions for research involving humans. They make sure that the research will be done following institutional policies or relevant state, federal, and other requirements. And apart from the common rule, there are, of course, other regulations that govern different aspects of research involving humans, such as privacy protections. So IRB professionals can really help protect an institution's reputation and integrity in the human research that they conduct. So for those non-exempt human subjects research that needs to go through the structured IRB process, remember, this is a very formalized and structured process under the common rule. The regulations stipulate who can be on the IRB board, what the composition for the IRB should be, what functions it plays, what are the operational procedures that need to be in place, how the research project needs to be reviewed, what criteria the IRB board needs to go through, and what is a voting process, and so on and so forth. So for the non-exempt human subjects research that needs to go through a formal IRB review, what are the IRB options available to institutions? Traditionally, the idea generally is for an institution to set up and use their own IRB for review of the research that they do. This makes sense if you have a large enough volume of such research to review. Institutions with a very big research portfolio conducting lots of clinical trials, for example, may even have more than one IRBs to serve the purpose. However, if you don't have a large enough research portfolio that requires the formal IRB review, then you may not want to invest the resources, be it money or staffing, to have your own IRB internally. Indeed, there is actually no requirement in the common rule for an institution conducting research to have their own IRB. The revised common rule actually have a new requirement for cooperative research to rely on the review of a single IRB. So some institutions would obviously will have to rely on an external, the single IRB. And the purpose for this is to reduce the duplicative process of having many different IRBs reviewing the same research. So if not your own, then what? Institutions can rely on an external IRB that it did not create, right? So this could be the IRB of a collaborating institution on the cooperative research, the IRB of another academic institution willing to provide the service for you, for your institution, or from a commercial IRB whose service you just purchased. As I have mentioned, the decision of whether to create and maintain your own or use an external IRB, an IRB external to your organization, that decision would likely depend on the volume of research requiring IRB reviews that your institution supports and the anticipated administrative burden and costs involved. I hope that you can see by now that the framework for protecting research participants is really a framework of partnerships. For the research enterprise to function well and for research to serve its function of advancing the common good, public trust is very important. To be able to uphold, maintain, and promote this public trust, it requires everyone to work together. This includes not only the regulators and the sponsors of research, but importantly, the institutions, the investigators, the reviewers, and of course, even the research participants. Everybody needs to put in their little bit to make it work. So we've come to the end of this presentation. I want to remind you that OHRP has developed this Human Research Protection Training Program with 5 lessons to provide a foundational training on the regulations on how the Common Rule framework work. You can access it through this link at the bottom. And this training is available free of charge to anyone who have access to our website. So hopefully you have noticed that we are really friendly people here at OHRP, especially those of us in the Division of Education. So do contact us if you have any questions related to the regulations, to the Common Rule specifically. You can write to us at ohrp@hhs.gov. We really put in an effort to try and respond to your questions within a couple of days. Do visit our OHRP website at hhs.gov/OHRP. You'll be surprised at how many useful resources you will be able to find to help you understand and apply the regulations and do ethical research. Check out OHRP's About Research Participation website, which provides a set of informational resources catered specifically for the public. These products are developed using plain language, and we put in a lot of effort to try and explain things, explain about research and about research participation to the general public. We want to make sure that they're easy to understand and that they can easily digest that information. So this brings me to the end of this presentation, and I'd like to thank everybody very much for your attention. We'll open the platform for questions now. Thank you so much.